Hi everyone, this is Daniel Gregg. In this video I'm going to talk about Acts 15, and I'm going to talk about a very specific verse in Acts 15, and that's going to be Acts 15:6. All right, so let's read the passage and its context first here. All right. Okay. And some men came down from Yehuda and were teaching the brothers, if you are not circumcised according to the custom of Moshe, you cannot be rescued. And when Paul and Barnabas had great dissension and debate with them, they determined that Paul and Barnabas and certain others of them should go up to Jerusalem to the emissaries and elders concerning this issue. Therefore, being helped forward by the assembly, they were going throughout, besides Phoenicia, also Shimron, describing in detail the conversion of the nations, and were bringing great joy to all the brothers. And when they arrived at Jerusalem, they were received by the assembly and the emissaries and the elders. Besides, also, they reported all that the Almighty had done with them. But stood up some of those from the party of the Perushim who had been holding faithful, saying, it is necessary to be circumcising them, besides to be commanding them to be keeping the law of Moshe. Okay, so this is the issue that was raised at the Jerusalem Council. It is necessary to be circumcising them, besides to be commanding them to be keeping the law of Moshe. Okay, so the way I have translated this here implies that they were already keeping the law of Moshe and they were already commanding and instructing to keep the law of Moshe, but there was no specific commanding going on to be circumcised. All right, so the usual way that this issue is framed is it's translated, it is necessary to be circumcising them and to be commanding them to keep the law of Moshe. And the way it's interpreted is as if neither of those two things were being done. Okay, but they were already commanding them to be keeping the law of Moses. And the circumcision issue was the real issue. That's why it's translated besides here. Okay, so the usual reasoning on this text goes that if they didn't command them to be circumcised and the law required circumcision, then clearly they had done away with the law, or the law was somehow, the Torah was somehow abolished by this statement. Because if you teach that one commandment is abolished, that's clearly a commandment, and then people will extrapolate, or you can reasonably extrapolate from the abolishment of one commandment to the abolishment of the whole. All right, but if that commandment actually isn't a commandment of the Torah, at least in the way they were teaching it, then actually the Torah wasn't abolished. So that's why it is important to see here that the circumcision issue and the direction to keep the Torah are actually two different issues. All right, and this is why I've translated besides. It is necessary to be circumcising them, besides to be commanding them to be keeping the law of Moshe. So they were already keeping the law of Moshe. Now, you could translate this slightly differently also. In a synonymous way, you could say, it is necessary to be circumcising them as well as to be commanding them to keep the law of Moshe. Okay, so what was the issue here? Well, the issue here was the circumcision of non-Jewish converts, okay? And we're talking about adult converts, okay? So if you read carefully in Genesis 17, you will see that there are only directions there for the circumcision, a perpetual circumcision of children, or the boy child, the male child, on the 8th day. There's actually no commandment there for the circumcision of adults. Okay, so now I want to keep this video short, so I don't want to exegete Genesis 17 for you in this video. So I'm just stating a position on it. Legally speaking, if someone wasn't circumcised on the 8th day, then the commandment had been missed. And when we're dealing with non-Jews who are in the dispersion and they're adults, the commandment actually doesn't apply because they're not bought with money into Abraham's household, and they weren't born into Abraham's household, and they're not entering the land. So I can point out a situation where a good deal of Israel wasn't circumcised, and that was in the wilderness when they were outside of the land, wandering in the wilderness. There were many of the sons that weren't circumcised during the 38 years that were born on the way. And they weren't condemned for that. The circumcision was only enforced when they came to Jericho and they were about to eat the Passover in the land. Okay, so this is an important point. And we see in Exodus chapter 12 that the sojourner could volunteer to be circumcised if he wanted to keep the Passover. The sojourner had to keep Sabbath and abstain from unleavened bread in any case, and to afflict his soul or their souls on Yom Kippur. But if the sojourner was not circumcised, then they were not allowed to eat the Passover. So there's actually a voluntary exemption in the law, okay, in the Torah, for an adult convert to not be circumcised. Now that doesn't make it so that they don't have to circumcise their sons. They should circumcise their sons, but their household is not allowed to eat the Passover unless they are all circumcised. All right, so this seems to be the halakhic position of the Jerusalem Council. And in order to support that, I've translated the text. Therefore, or it is necessary to be circumcising them, besides to be commanding them to keep the law of Moshe. All right, now I would like to present some support for this translation. Okay, so the usual translations have the word "and" in between the two issues here. It's necessary to be circumcising them and to be commanding them to keep the law of Moses, as if they were both issues at the council rather than just one of these two issues, and they wanted that one issue emphasized. The Greek word for "and" is "k," okay, or spelled kappa alpha iota, and the word that's here in the text is actually a different word. It's te, spelled tau epsilon. All right, and te has a slightly different nuance than ke. K, okay? So, and it can mean as well as or besides. So I want to present you some evidence that that's what it means here. Okay, so often this word is translated both in the context, B-O-T-H, both. So a possible translation would be, it is necessary to both circumcise them and command them to keep the law of Moses. And the idea here is that they were commanding them to do one of those things, but not the other. Okay, and so these Pharisees were concerned that they wanted both to happen right away. All right, another way. Let's see now. There is a way to interpret it with the and that would be to take the land and as a logical and, as if we would say, this is how you would read it. It's necessary to be circumcising them and commanding them to keep the law of Moses. In other words, they were doing one of those things, but they wanted to make sure circumcision was included in it too. And you can see why some might think that circumcision shouldn't be included for adult converts. Okay, that was the issue before the council. All right, so I mentioned the both, I mentioned the and, I mentioned the as well as. Now I translate it besides, which is a synonym as well as. Okay, it means in addition to, the same as both or as well as. Okay, so I'm going to present some evidence here that that's the case. Okay, so I took a a little snapshot here of Bill Mons's Greek lexicon on his website, where he discusses a particular verse in Matthew, and I'll post it up on the screen here. Okay, so you're not going to see my face on the screen because I'm over at my other computer and I'm going to read it, but this microphone system will allow it to pick up over there, and then we could edit it in. All right, so in Mons's online Greek-English concordance for te, in Matthew 22:10, he has, so these servants went out into the streets and gathered everyone they could find, rogues as well as honorable men, and the wedding hall was packed with guests. So he's translating te here as well as. Okay, so now I'm going to show you the Good News of Messiah translation. So now I'm going to show you the Good News of Messiah translation for that passage. All right, so that's in Matthew 22:10 here. And those slaves, having gone out into the byways, gathered together all they found, the evil besides also the good. And the wedding feast was filled up with reclining dinner guests. Okay, so I translate it as besides also. So that's the words tekeh or tekai, and that would have the same sense as besides. Okay, so what they're doing here is they're mentioning the evil besides also the good. So ordinarily you would gather up the good. So that's the second after these particles, okay? And the unusual is that you gathered up the evil besides the good. So there's what would be assumed after the conjunctions versus what specifically might be not considered that you want to focus on would come first, okay? So this is why it says it's necessary to circumcise them besides also to keep the law of Moshe, okay? Because it was assumed that that was the ordinary thing, that they were already being commanded that, but they weren't specifically being commanding them to circumcise them, okay? And so they wanted to emphasize that point. Okay, so Mons there has translated it as well as, okay, which is equivalent to besides. Okay, so I'm going to go look at it and I'll keep talking a little bit and you can listen. I'm not too fond of Bill Mons because he does things like translate the word, like translates the word pistos as believer, and anytime he wants to give a Gnostic point of view on the translation, he takes the opportunity to do that. But in this case, his scholarship agrees with what I've looked at before. Okay, Mons number 2 here. In Luke 22:66, he has, and this is another case of te, okay, and when the day came, the council of elders and the people was assembled, both chief priests and scribes, and they had Jesus brought into their council chamber. Okay, so that's Luke 22:66. Okay, so let's check out Luke 22:66 in the Good News of Messiah. All right, Luke 22:66. And when it became day, the elders' assembly of the people were gathered together, as well as the chief priests and the scribes. And they led him away to the council chamber. All right, so Mons's translation has a slight problem. By using the translation both, he has implied that the categories being contrasted are the priests and the scribes, and this is not the case. The categories being contrasted are the elders' assembly on the one hand and the priests and scribes on the other hand. so that it's the elders' assembly of the people were gathered together, as well as the chief priests and the scribes. So ordinarily, the chief priests and the scribes would gather by themselves to hold a council, but then to call in the whole assembly of the people, that's the focal point here, to all involve all the elders of the people in it. Okay, so the contrast is between those two categories. Okay, and I translate it as well as the chief priests, like Mons did in that other text. Okay, so this is what te means in Greek. Okay, so now let's move on to our other examples. Okay, so you see that they're singling out circumcision over what would be considered ordinarily already mentioned or already known about, was that they were commanding them to keep the law. Okay, and Yeshua already mentioned that in Matthew 28:18 through 20, commanding them to observe everything I have commanded you. And they were Jews, and he had commanded them to keep the Torah. This is Henry George Liddell and Robert Scott's lexicon from 1863. I believe it's the 5th edition, publisher Clarendon Press, and it was digitized on Google May 26, 2016. Okay, so let's see what this says on the word te. Okay, te, enclitic particle. Okay, so they have and here, but usually in Homer and almost always later, te is a real conjunction, and so on and so on. And so we jump down to the clauses here. 2, 1, the full conjunction, te, both, and, as well as. So they see that as well as is one of the translations that they have for that. So that's a pretty popular, early edition of a pretty popular lexicon there. All right. Let's look over here in, there was a discussion on stack exchange here, and here's the question. What is the force of te as used in Hebrews 4:12? Textus receptus. Okay, and the first answer came back. There we go. Which basically translates this verse of, look at the third line here, of the soul as well as of the spirit, of the joints as well as the marrows. So the Word of God is dividing the soul as well as the spirit. I think that's what it says in the context. We'd have to look up the Hebrews text, but I'm not too concerned about it here. You can look at this, do a word search on this and find it on Stack Exchange if you want. But you see the translation as well as for te here. Okay, and one more resource here. So this is on a website that discusses the meaning of the Greek word here. The enclitic te has two main uses, which is essential to distinguish, besides one or two special uses of less importance. As a conjunction, te connects clauses and single words. It is especially used when a new fact or object is to take its place, para passu, with what has already been said. Okay, we'll look this up and see what this means in a minute, but here's how they translate it. To dogs and birds as well. Okay, and they always put the conjunction here after the first word in a clause here. So literally it should be translated to dogs as well as birds. Okay, but notice as well here. Okay, so let's look up the further context of this here. All right, pari passu is a Latin phrase that literally means with an equal step or on equal footing. So what it means is someone is wanting to emphasize something as on equal footing as something else. All right, and we can see that when they use as well as is introducing the ordinary thing. The extraordinary thing was before it. And they want to put the extraordinary thing, the emphasized thing, first in the clause. All righty. Okay, so this next quote these words are actually from the Iliad, Book 1, lines 1 through 15, which is by Homer. Okay, and so let's find a little English translation of this here. Okay, so this is an English translation of that passage. Black and murderous, the cost, the Greeks, incalculable pain, pitched countless souls of heroes into Hades dark, and left their bodies to rot as feasts. For dogs and birds, as Greek god, will be done, as blankety blanks will be done. Begin with the clash between Agamemnon, the Greek warlord, and godlike Achilles. Okay, so the phrase we're looking at here is for dogs and birds. Okay, and left their bodies to rot as feasts. So it's talking about battlefield carnage here. For dogs and birds. Okay, so literally this would be a feast made to dogs as well as birds. Okay, so this is the te here at the and, as well as birds. So ordinarily the carry-on, the birds would feast on the battlefield. Okay, the unusual element here that's being emphasized is dogs, dogs as well as birds. Okay, so we can see how this te can give you an acceptive contrast to a pair of items, okay? So that's what we're talking about here in Acts 15, okay? We're talking about making a distinction between the commandment or the wish that they be circumcised and the wish that they be instructed to follow the law of Moshe. Okay, so I'll read you the text once again here. Let's go back to Acts 15 here. It is necessary to be circumcising them, besides to be commanding them to be keeping the law of Moshe. Or we could translate that. It is necessary to be circumcising them as well as to be commanding them to be keeping the law of Moshe. So they were already commanded to keep the law of Moshe. They just weren't specifically commanding the adult non-Jews to be circumcised. Okay, so we can jump over to one verse here and kind of confirm that. In verse 21, it says here, for Moshe from ancient generations has those throughout the cities proclaiming him, since he has read in the congregations throughout every Sabbath. So what Yaakov is saying here, or James is saying here, is he's saying that we don't need to specifically instruct them on the issue of the law of Moshe. They're already being instructed in the law of Moshe. This is what was assumed, that they were already being told. The issue was only circumcision. So he didn't pass a ruling saying that they had to be circumcised. He didn't agree with these people. He just encouraged them to, let's see, it says here in Acts 15:20, but they propose that they write to them that they keep themselves from the defilements of idols and from fornication and from what is strangled and from blood. So they were giving them a minimal list of what they could be to be accepted in the community and to have fellowship with other Jews. They didn't have to have with Jews. They didn't have to be circumcised to do that. Okay, circumcision could come later. Okay, and the reason was that this was such a hot issue is because for some, circumcision was a salvation issue. It couldn't be postponed. Okay, and however, according to the emissaries, it was not a salvation issue. It's not, if you want a kind of an analogy on this, it's kind of like the Catholic Church or the Eastern Orthodox Church teaching that it's absolutely necessary for a child to be baptized, often usually sprinkled or poured upon, in order to not go to hell, in order to be saved. But the Anabaptists and the Baptists teach adult believers baptism, okay, or immersion, because it's a symbol of the faith. It's not the actual covenant itself, all right? In a similar fashion, circumcision is a symbol or a sign of the covenant. It's not the actual covenant itself, all right? And the commandment is clearly geared to get all Israel circumcised at some point, but there is some leniency in the commandment for those who weren't circumcised on the eighth day. Okay, and that's what the elders and the emissaries were citing on. Okay, so that kind of resolves the issue in this text. This is not an anti-circumcision text, as some may think. It doesn't, their decision and discussion doesn't imply that the Torah overall was abolished. And in fact, all they're telling the community is that circumcision doesn't actually apply in this case. It only applies in the case that's specified in the Torah. Okay, so actually no commandment is actually being abolished or set aside here. All right, thank you for listening. Dan Gregg, over and out.